the question that I like to ask is like, what would change if you saw yourself as a worker? Because most of us are workers, you know? And so, how does that change the conversations you have with your colleagues, with how you structure your time, how you think about your hobbies, how you think about your whole life?
Welcome to Bitch Talk. I'm your host, Erin.
And I'm co-host Ange, aka Captain Party.
And for more than 11 years, the show has celebrated underrepresented voices in pop culture and beyond.
But not in the snore kind of way, which is why our listeners and followers have graciously voted us Best of the Bay, Best Podcast on 48 Hills for 3 years in a row. Three-peat, bitches.
If you like what you hear, follow us on Instagram and check out our website, Bitch Talk Podcast, and rate us wherever you listen to podcasts.
We're begging you to judge us. When does that ever happen? Oh, you're not going to say anything?
Oh, what'd I say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, on that note, on with the show. Clink.
All right, Bitch Talkers, we are excited and relieved to finally be bringing on one of the producers of a documentary union, Samantha Curley. Thank you so much for being on Bitch Talk, Samantha.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Before we even get into the film, I think it's worth telling our listeners and our followers we have been working really hard to get together and chat. The holidays came. We were going to chat last week, and the fires started in LA, and you were affected by those. And I just want to talk about that a little bit, if you're comfortable with that, and talk about what's happening right now in LA, specifically maybe in your neighborhood or where you live.
Yeah, it has been just absolutely devastating to see what's happening. I've lived in LA for 14 years now. I live in Echo Park, so I'm not directly impacted by the fires. We weren't on an evacuation notice, but I have a lot of friends, especially in the who live in Altadena and have been devastatingly impacted by the Eaton fires. People on our team from Union have been impacted in various ways. And it's really just heartbreaking. And I think going to be a really long rebuilding process for the city, and especially for the creative community here and, for the independent documentary scene in particular, which I feel most connected to. It's just really brutal. And there's a number of good resources. I would particularly point people to looking up the databases of GoFundMe's of Black and Brown families impacted by the Altadena fires. It's one of the longest standing communities of Black and Brown homeowners, and they really need a lot of support. So it's easy to find databases of GoFundMe's there. I know that there's some people in the doc community that are putting together resources and fundraisers as well. But I think at a time like this, in any way you can get money directly to people who've lost their homes and lost kind of everything. I think that's the best thing we can do in the short and long term.
Thank you so much for sharing. I wasn't sure. I mean, this is so fresh and it's still going on. I don't know. I'm trying to follow the news cycle of everything that's going on, whether it's on the TV or on social media. And I feel like, are things contained right now?
Yeah. So it's Thursday, January 16th.
Yes, right. What day is it?
Depending on when you're listening. And the Eaton fire, I think, is contained close to 50% at this point. And the Palisades fire, I think, is still only at like 20% contained. So I don't think that the fires are actively threatening any more homes or infrastructure. But, it's brutal out there. And I think it's important to name that so many of the people on the front lines are in prison and are being paid basically nothing to be on the front lines of these natural disasters. And in the state of California, we voted in this last election to not protect the livelihoods of people who are imprisoned. And so basically slave labor is happening to protect people's homes. And there are also ways that you can give to those on the front lines who are serving time in prison.
Thank you so much for mentioning all of that. Again, we appreciate you being open about it. I do want to talk about union, which is very timely as well. If you could do me a favor and introduce the film to our audience, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So Union is a feature-length documentary film that follows, in a very embedded observational verite way, follows the unionization campaign of an Amazon warehouse in Staten Island. The group is called the Amazon Labor Union. It was an entirely independent union. Led by Chris Smalls, who was fired from Amazon in 2020 after leading a walkout in protest of the lack of COVID safety precautions at the warehouse. And I don't think at this point it's a surprise that they win this election and they become the first unionized warehouse, Amazon warehouse, in the country, which nobody thought was possible. They had raised $120,000 on GoFundMe and defeated Amazon's multi-million-dollar campaign against them. And the film is really about group dynamics and organizing and what politicizes us and what makes anybody believe that they can actually materially improve the conditions of their lives. And so I do think it's incredibly relevant, not just within the labor movement right now, but just looking at all of the things we're facing, existential questions and problems we're facing as a society of like, do we actually believe it can be better? And what does it look like to organize and work towards that?
Yeah, something that I really love about this film and also your part in it is as a filmmaker on a story like this, you're actually part of the fight. You are standing up for something by making this film, and especially a film that's about worker exploitation coming from the independent film world, and arguably in any sector that happens. But can you talk about just your activism within this film and how it was born? Because really it was you and your co-producer that were really gung-ho about making this work.
Yeah, so thank you for asking that. And it is really important for all of us as a film team. We entered this project with like shared values around being part of and being for this movement. We never had any conversations of like, are we going to be flies on the wall and try to present kind of both sides? That was never the conversation. We really engaged this project in solidarity with workers. And Mars Verone, my other producer, and I actually met through Chris Smalls. We had each reached out independently as organizers. This was in the summer of 2020, and Chris wasn't even thinking about unionizing. He was kind of going around with his friends from Amazon trolling Jeff Bezos. They were doing like protests. It's so good. They were doing protests.
Hey, it's COVID. You got time.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. They were going around the country at all of Jeff Bezos's various mansions and protesting. And so they came to LA, and Mars and I both helped plan that action in Beverly Hills, which just, fun celebrity gossip. Jeff Bezos no longer owns that home in Beverly Hills. Beyonce does, which I think is funny.
That's interesting.
Yeah. But yeah, so that's where it started. It really started, and we built a relationship with Chris from the foundation of organizing, and talking about the project along the way. And it took us a while to kind of figure out what a project could be. We knew Chris would be part of it, but was it about Amazon? Was it about one particular warehouse? Was it about the labor movement more broadly? Was it just about Chris? Like, what was the story? And so we were doing a lot of research and developing the project, talking with directors and other people we could bring on to the team. And I had seen Brett Story had made a short film called Camper Force that you can watch on Field of Vision that she made with Jess Bruder, who's the author of Nomadland, the book.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
And the short film, Camper Force, is a much more honest look. Nomadland, the movie, is great, but isn't particularly unbiased in its perspective of Amazon. So, anyways, I had seen the short film that Brett had made, and we started talking, and it kind of aligned where I was able to raise some money, and Brett agreed to come on, and we started filming right before they announced the union campaign. So we were there literally from day one of this effort, and Stephen Mang came on shortly after as a co-director, which was always the intention, to really build a team that was collaborative, that was reflective of the effort we were following, which is the thing I get really excited about as a producer, of like how we get to make a thing is reflective of the thing we're making. And yeah, Steve and our cinematographer, Martin Chico, spent like over 300 days on the ground doing overnights out in the blistering cold, the heat. They were deeply embedded in the campaign.
Actually, that's my follow-up question. You're watching this film and y'all are going through it. Everyone that's on the ground and the inclement weather and during COVID, and Amazon's actively going after the folks that are outside in those tents. Can you talk about how your filmmakers were feeling? And were there moments where they're like, yeah, I don't know if we can do this?
Yeah. I think I was not in the field very much. It was a very small team because we didn't want to have too big of a footprint to interrupt any of the organizing happening. But I can say from what, we talked about as a team, and Steve and Martin in particular have talked about, is it our efforts and exhaustion really paled in comparison to the workers. And I think that was incredibly motivating. And that, we would be watching workers who are single parents, are commuting 2 hours each way to the warehouse, working 12-hour overnight shifts, getting out of the building and going to the tent to talk to their coworkers about forming a union night after night after night. And so I think, it was a very grueling production on the team, but wasn't actually something that got in the way of what we were doing. And we've continued, even we filmed months after we filmed for almost a year after they won the election, actually, most of which is not in the film. And we actually were just filming the recent strikes that Amazon workers did against Amazon during the holiday season, and actually just put out a short film about those strikes. That's called Local One, which you can also watch on the Field of Vision website. So we're like really deeply in the movement and feel really committed to the folks who shared their lives with us on screen and those who have joined since. And I think it's been really life-giving and rewarding to feel like our efforts as filmmakers are not just for the sake of this film, but it really is part of the organizing efforts.
Mm-hmm.
So anytime you're taking on a corporation, let alone Amazon, which is arguably the largest in our world, it's frightening, right? But a topic that I love that you bring up is that other people's risks are greater based on race. And Chris, being a Black man, being at the helm of this with no experience in forming a union, he took on the greatest risk of all. So can you talk about that concept, and were you behind the scenes kind of hyping him up, because it's exhausting and obviously at times you'd want to quit?
Yeah. Chris doesn't need a lot of hyping up. Chris has a lot of hype in him. He's so great. I think that it was one of the things that we were most interested in was the race and class dynamics that were, apparent early on in the organizing and became even more so throughout the campaign. Just like people's positionality around race, class, and gender and education, and what like solidarity actually looks like. And it was one of the hardest parts of making of production was we had such good relationships with all of the organizers. And as you see in the film, there's a lot of conflict, and there's a lot of infighting that happens, which is actually part of the union busting and part of the way that capitalism and racism work against us is to divide us and turn us against one another. And so it's those forces that are like putting pressure on this group of people who were working together and started to have some disagreements, and to be on all sides of those disagreements and feel like, oh my gosh, when do we say something? How do we manage all of these different relationships? And because we weren't interested in just observing, we were really see ourselves as part of the movement of like when to step in and when to try to help negotiate some of these differences was really interesting and challenging. And I think that I think one of the things people love most about the film and appreciate most about the film is that it doesn't shy away from showing those hurdles and showing how difficult it really is, and the ways that race in particular, and also class and gender, like operate to suppress our power and our ability to earn power together.
Before we wrap, we still have a few minutes, but I know this is like a twofer, and if Ange has more questions, I want her to ask too. But what has been the impact of this film as you've toured it around? And I know when I saw you, and whenever that was, the fall at some point,
Yeah.
y'all were talking about it's really hard to find a streaming service to carry this because no one wants to go against Amazon. So can you talk about those two things, the impact and then trying to find a place for this film?
Yeah, I'll start with the impact. I think there's kind of two ways that we've had hoped to have impact. One is with Amazon workers. We really wanted to make a film for Amazon workers. And there have been some really exciting things we've gotten to do with the film we screened the film at Labor Notes, which is the biggest labor conference in the US. We got to screen the film in the spring with a group of workers who had formed an independent union in Raleigh, Durham, at an Amazon facility there. And we brought folks from the ALU who are in the film down to the screening, and like the questions and the conversation was so different than any, festival or theatrical screening we've done, where people were asking, worker to worker questions like, how do I know when someone's a union buster on the shop floor? Just like a very different kind of question. And that building actually just filed for a union election, and they're going to be voting a month from now, and definitely worth following along. The building is called RDU1, and the independent union they formed is called Cause, and it's a Black and Brown led coalition of workers. And if they're able to be successful in the South, like that is going to be huge for the labor movement overall. And so the film even getting to play a small role in those kinds of efforts, or workers from Staten Island who really want to connect with workers in Minneapolis, and like getting to use the film as a way to get resources and support for these kind of connections to happen worker to worker is really, really exciting. And then I think the other piece of impact is, with a broader audience. And I think people often question, like, should I cancel my Amazon membership? Should I boycott Amazon? Like, what's the call to action I can do? And it's not really a film that is about that, or that there's something so clear cut to take away from. I think it's much more about a kind of consciousness raising effort. And the question that I like to ask is like, what would change if you saw yourself as a worker? Because most of us are workers, you know? And so, how does that change the conversations you have with your colleagues, with how you structure your time, how you think about your hobbies, how you think about your whole life? And that feels like the impact we really hope this film has, to say, like, we actually are all united. Most of us are united by this identity of worker. And it's not something that many of us hold very closely. And then in terms of distribution, you know, we certainly never expected Amazon would buy the film, and which hasn't happened.
Yeah.
And
I was
I
like,
think
wait,
we,
what? Did
yeah,
they?
yeah,
No,
can you
they
imagine?
did. Yes.
We were like, they'll buy it and try to bury it.
Right.
We didn't even get that far. So, you know, one of the things that's surprising and not surprising is how threatening organized labor is
Hmm.
to institutional power. And every distributor, a major distributor, is part of that kind of institutional power. And so, you know, for sure, Amazon is part of why I think we've struggled to get major distribution. A lot of companies around the industry, in the industry, do business with Amazon, but I think it's even deeper and more insidious than that, of the threat of organized labor. And, you know, Disney park
Hmm.
workers have been trying to unionize for a long time, and Apple retail workers have been trying to unionize for a long time, and PBS isn't unionized despite being a public broadcaster. You know, like, these are issues that are at the core of every distributor. And it's a little bit disheartening, but I guess not surprising that nobody's interested in really taking a look at that. And so we've been able to distribute the film ourselves independently, and really take up the mantle of the ALU, in getting the film directly to people. And that's actually been incredibly rewarding and exciting and successful. And yeah, I hope is a way forward for so many of us in the film industry and the documentary space in particular, that we don't have to always rely on
Mhm.
institutional power, resources, access. It certainly takes a lot of labor, it takes a lot of resources, but there are ways to find your audience, you know, outside of those gatekeepers.
Mhm. That was going to be my last follow-up that I was going to ask you. So you won at Sundance in 2024 the documentary special jury award for The
Mhm.
Art of Change.
Yeah.
And watching this film, it's clear to see why you won that award. So congratulations. But I wanted to follow up on the big labor unions, because it's such a disappointment that they didn't have ALUs back. And I'm curious to see if have any of them watched the film? Has it sort of shifted some minds? Because that could be a huge change in the movement.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, a big update is that over the summer of 2024, the ALU affiliated with the Teamsters. And so there has been, and it's been a big conversation because of the ALU's success, of the connection and relationship between institutionalized unions and institutionalized labor and these more grassroots upstart worker-led movements that are largely taking cues and lessons from Black Lives Matter and climate activism, and, you know, much more kind of grassroots. And I think the one of the things that gives me the most hope is that those groups are, like, really starting to understand they need each other, and if it's part of the organizing of all labor. And so, yeah, I think the conversation has shifted significantly from when the ALU started their campaign, and a lot of the unions have been really supportive of the film. The SEIU, the Service Workers Union, has been screening the film as part of their kind of like training modules and leadership development. When we screened the film in theaters here in LA, we did it in partnership with the UTLA, the second biggest teachers union in the country. So there's been a lot of support, broad spectrum support from the labor movement and from unions in particular for the film. And I think it's because the film shows so many of these lessons when it comes to how institutional labor and more upstart labor can really work together, how workers can work together across race, class, and gender, the role of, college educated SALT in the movement. There's like a lot that the film brings up that I think is lessons that labor needs to learn moving forward. And, I know we don't have time to get into it all the way, but the trajectory of workers' rights in our country has never been more bleak. Amazon and Trader Joe's and SpaceX are trying to get a case in front of the Supreme Court to say that the NLRB and the National Relations Labor Act is unconstitutional, which would mean, we would have no child labor laws. We'd have no weekends. So many of what we assume is just part of normal working conditions would be totally gone. And so I think labor is one of the broad spectrum ways forward. And we have a lot to learn, in the fight ahead.
Samantha, thank you so much for being on Bitch Talk. Thank you for talking about Union. Can you tell everyone where to find Union?
Yes. The easiest place is at our website, unionthefilm.com. You could also follow us on social media at Union the Film across all platforms. Because we're distributing the film ourselves, it's always changing where to get access to it, but we're working hard to make access as big and broad as possible. So head there and thanks for having me and Union on and just all the support you do to lift up independent film. It's really exciting.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us on today's show. You can find more information about this episode in our show notes.
If you're missing us, you can visit us at bitchtalkpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter and buy us a cup of coffee.
Did you know we're also on the radio? You can find us at bff.fm.
And lastly, rate and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. All the cool bitches are doing it.
This podcast is a proud member of the BFF.fm podcast network. Learn more at podcasts.bff.fm.
BFF.fm, best frequencies forever.